Rice Peas is our correspondent, and he'll be interviewing Kingsley Mamabolo. Good evening to you, Sherwin.
Babakshani, nice to see you. Thanks so very much indeed. As you mentioned, I do have South Africa's permanent representative to the United Nations, Kingsley Mamabolo, joining me here in studio within the Secretariat building of the United Nations. We happen to just call you Mr. Ambassador. Sir, nice to see you. Thank you very much indeed.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Babakshani just introduced the very broad basis at which the United Nations approaches various issues around the world, be it humanitarian, be it politics, developmental issues, putting boots on the ground. It has a broad mandate, does the United Nations, and yet it hasn't really succeeded in arenas like Syria, the DRC, the Palestinian-Israeli question. Is the United Nations still relevant in the geopolitical world we find ourselves in today?
Well, first, Sean, let me say, I think we ought to congratulate SABC for this launch. I would also say very timely indeed that you are launching this. But regarding your question, let me say, United Nations is not very perfect. We are fighting as South Africa, as part of the developing world, to transform the organization. We consider that it is not right, for example, that Africa is not represented in the Security Council. But along with that, we're also saying not just the United Nations, but the entire good institutions would need transformation. Whether it is relevant, let me say this very briefly. Look, despite its weaknesses and problems, it continues and remains to be the only international organization that deals with this issue. So it is an arena in which we have to fight to ensure that it can intervene in all those areas and to make it relevant. It is our duty, it is an obligation on us, particularly those who are on the receiving side of some of these horrendous problems.
I mean, let's look at some of the arena where it does intervene, specifically in the African context. The DRC, of course, is a broad conversation here and at the African Union and around the world. South Africa has just sent over 1,000 troops into the DRC to bolster what is being called an intervention brigade. And given what has happened in the following what happened in the Central African Republic, a lot of criticism aimed at the South African government for sending in those troops. Why does South Africa believe so much in this intervention brigade, an untested brigade in battle and unprecedented in so many ways, by sending our troops into this battlefield arena?
Well, South Africa is a player very central to the solution of the problems, and I think this is recognized even in the United Nations. And so we've been very bold. We can't sit by and watch the conflict fall apart. Clearly we have done a lot. There has been a lot of improvement in the continent, but we still have those windows where you have serious problems remaining, and it is up to the continent itself to get involved. We can't sit comfortably and say, as a country that has been identified as a role player in the continent, we don't want to get involved, we don't want to be tarnished, we don't want to be affected by these kind of things, and we would want actually to take leadership in those areas, and certainly that includes involvement in all areas, including military.
Specifically regarding this intervention brigade, many member states have raised concern that the people this intervention brigade will be engaging, the rebels, the M23 in the east of the DRC, will not be concerned to make a distinction between what is an intervention brigade and what is the normal UN peacekeepers. The UN has 19,000 peacekeepers, to which South Africa also has contributed contingents. They're not going to make a distinction. Do we not put normal peacekeepers' blue helmets at greater risk?
Well, I think what SADC has pushed for and what has happened in the DRC is that we have changed the role of the United Nations in a significant manner. We have decided that the UN is not just going to sit by, as has happened. We've had numerous examples. I recall the struggle in Syria alone, where in actual fact the rebels would even go to the extent of taking weapons from the UN forces. And the struggle in the DRC has been going on for too long. And we are saying, where appropriate, it should be possible in defense of the people on the ground to intervene, even if it means using some force of some sort. And so that is what SADC has done. It is now regarded as a model And the United Nations is actually looking at that as to use that same model in any other struggles abroad.
Let's move the conversation further north of the continent. South Africa has been quite outspoken about the removal of President Mohamed Morsi in Egypt and the unconstitutional change of government there. The AU immediately acted to suspend Egypt. But we've seen very sort of careful language from the United Nations. So I wonder, they've certainly not condemned what has happened in Egypt. So I wonder what the African ambassadors, what does the Africa group here at the United Nations say to people within the UN Secretariat? What is that conversation like? We calling it a coup, we've suspended, and you sort of, choosing your words carefully.
Well, I did say that we have an obligation as Africa to take the lead on these issues, and that's what Africa has done. We are bound by our own description of what happens in the continent, and insofar as Africa is concerned, it's unconstitutional, and any unconstitutional decision taken anyway ought to be condemned. And so we are quite right. The African ambassadors will be discussing this to say, how do we take this matter and ensure that the United Nations is also in line with the thinking of Africa.
Why is it not, though, Ambassador? What's your sense from these behind closed doors discussions that you're party to? What's the sense as to why the United Nations has not come out, as it has done in other conflicts around the world, particularly in the African continent, to condemn a coup is a coup is a coup? No?
Coup is a coup is a coup. And of course, you are also aware that there are various interests all over the world, but we have our own interests as Africa, and that's what we are pushing. As far as we are concerned, any unconstitutional form of government must be condemned, and we must encourage those involved to move towards constitutionality.
This was a little before your time, but South Africa was, of course, part of the UN Security Council when it first appeared on its agenda, the question of Syria, which is now a conflict that has gone on for over 2.5 years. We just heard last week that the casualty number has exceeded 100,000. Millions of people have been displaced, impacting Lebanon, Iraq, various other countries, Jordan in the region. Is this, Ambassador, a failure of a United Nations broadly, the UN Security Council, or is this a failure of individual member states not to act?
Well, we've also deplored the situation in Syria. We have said that the United Nations Security Council in particular needs to act much more decisively. We deplored the fact that within the UN Security Council itself we have not had an agreement, which in a sense has delayed progress towards that. And again, as Africa, we would be calling on the UN Security Council to ensure that it does indeed get involved decisively and ensure a conclusion to this process, but primarily really to encourage the Syrians to find a solution that is Syrian-born, that is Syrian endorsed by the people of Syria.
South Africa spent 2 years in the Security Council not too long ago. You then moved into ECOSOC for a 3-year period. Tell us about your work in ECOSOC and why this is also important moving forward as we move from the Millennium Development Goals to the SDGs come 2015.
Well, let me first say, leaving the Security Council does not entail that we are not dealing with those issues. We continue to. In fact, the issues in the Security Council are of importance. Very, very significant that we continue to be seized with those, to be in touch with those who are in the Security Council, and to give our input as much as we can. But of course, you are dealing, as you say, with Millennium Development Goals, post-2015 SDGs, and we would want to see that the United Nations takes appropriate decisions that would ensure that the affected people, the poor and on the ground, benefit from the decisions that are taken. And so we're very much involved with driving this process. We would want to see Africa as a whole making a bigger impact on those.
Ambassador, always good to see you. Thank you for your time today. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Evan. It's always a pleasure.
Kingsley Mamabolo is South Africa's a permanent representative to the United Nations, who, as I mentioned earlier, we just call Mr. Ambassador, and been in the job for less than 6 months. Told me when he arrived here that there's a lot to chew off at the United Nations, but we all think he's doing okay. So Peter Ndora and Vabakshini Chetty in Johannesburg, I have a feeling we're going to have a few conversations in the days, weeks and months ahead. What do you think?
Definitely. That was our correspondent in the US, Sherwin Bryce Pease, talking to South Africa's permanent representative, Kingsley Mamabolo.